Hello everyone, my name is Andrew, and this is my look into the Witcher series on Netflix, where I intend to point out various things about the show, primarily focusing on the writing, but also some other things that come up which I may find worth mentioning as we go on. I had watched the show during the most recent winter holiday, and I initially liked it quite a bit following that viewing, but I wasn't able to put the show out of my mind as time went on, since I had this lingering feeling that there's something about the show that didn't quite land with me, but that I wasn't really able to figure out what that was. As I'm certain most of you know, that sort of feeling can pretty much drive you mad, since you simply have to know what it is that you're missing. I finally decided to take a more focused look at what the show does with this first season in an attempt to find out exactly what it was that failed to click in my brain. This is that process. Needless to say, here be spoilers, and I hope you enjoy. As the episode starts, we get our first glimpse of the show via a slow panning shot of a bog. We focus on the body of perfectly still water, and just as a deer gets close, the dead calm of the water is stirred slightly by bubbles which start surfacing from below. A monster suddenly emerges, bringing up Henry Cavill along with it. Cavill cuts off a limb, lands back into the water, and we proceed to see a series of exchanges between the two. The monster manages to grab onto him with one of its 8 limbs and pushes Cavill back underwater, causing him to drop his sword. Cavill struggles to break free, while also dodging a series of attacks from the creature, and after eventually managing to grab his sword, he slices one of the beast's limbs, which causes it to recoil, bringing Cavill back to his feet as it does so, and only to have the exchange end with the monster getting impaled onto his sword as it comes back down. As the fight ends, we get our first close-up shot of Cavill's character. He looks deathly pale, with fully black eyes and what appears to be clearly visible blackish veins on his forehead and under the eyes. He makes his way ashore, and as he does, we get another look at the deer from earlier, wounded by the monster initially emerging from the water. Cavill says,
"Today isn't your day, is it?"
in this low, gravelly voice with a British accent. There is no such accent in the games, but then again the character was originally created by a Polish author in a book written in Polish. So really this shouldn't be relevant in any way other than if it ever becomes an indicator of the different regions within the world of The Witcher, as in we can tell where the characters we come across are from based on their accents. Think Spanish for Dorne, or heavy northern British accent for the denizens of the north in Game of Thrones, and so on. Another note on the voice that Cavill puts on for the character is that it is somewhat odd given that the actor has a decently deep voice, but not naturally coarse or gravelly in this particular manner, and for him to maintain this effect he has to speak quite a bit more quietly and closer to the mic to get it to come across strongly enough. But since this is screen acting and not voice work, I expect this to be quite difficult to do in shot, which gives me the impression that most of his dialogue is dubbed in post in order to compensate for this. Now, this isn't inherently an issue whatsoever, and isn't necessarily one in this scenario either, as it makes the character come across as slightly off, slightly unnatural, perhaps a bit alien, which would in fact be a significant positive since we find out a bit later on that in universe, the Witchers as a whole are looked at as being quite unnatural or inhuman, and people react to them accordingly. So whether this was intentional or just a happy coincidence, it works in the show's favor, so good on you, crew. So, there's quite a bit that happened during this introductory scene, and unfortunately there are quite a number of things that are not so great. If we look at the fight scene narratively, it's all perfectly fine. We see our main character defeating a monster like a badass to immediately solidify him as a strong dude who can very much handle himself even in very trying circumstances, and that this is something that he's used to dealing with based on his level of calm immediately following his victory. But if we take it as a piece of cinema and we scrutinize the craft that went into making it as well, we come across a number of problems right off the bat. Firstly, this is something that will become quite a bit more noticeable as the show goes on, and even later in this very episode, but the folks responsible for putting all of this stuff together make some very heavy and very glaring use of color filters for many of the scenes. This scene in particular, for instance, is very heavily monochrome and very heavily contrasted, giving it this almost Sin City-esque visual aesthetic, but without the bright red to pop on screen, which makes the whole thing look very visually muddy. All just a sea of strongly contrasting shades of gray. Another effect of this is that it makes the environment look almost as if all of the vegetation is covered in a thick layer of ash or tar, which may have been what they were going for, but is quite jarring to see as a visual artistic direction. Moving past the elements which are purely aesthetic, we get to what is actually taking place in the scene itself, once we slow down the action and attempt to keep track of the movements and the environment. The action was actually quite difficult to follow, and it required going through it repeatedly frame by frame until I was finally able to get an understanding of what is going on here. The situation is only made more difficult by what I will be illustrating as a number of inconsistencies, which serve to confuse anyone attempting to follow along to a greater or lesser degree. To start out, we need to have a quick glance at what this creature looks like and how it functions. The monster has 8 limbs, which appear to all be vaguely similar in that they all sprout out from the creature's torso in a spider-like configuration. They have multiple joints, and they have a very basic, albeit crude, ability to grip onto larger creatures or objects. All 8 limbs are used interchangeably either as legs or as arms, and it does not seem to have any particular preference as to which are used for what purpose, except perhaps the 2 backmost ones, which are only used for support, at least while the creature's on screen. It may not in fact have such a preference, but merely wasn't in a situation where using those limbs for anything other than for support would have been advantageous. Also, this thing seems to be an alternate fantasy universe version of what we know as a pug. Spooky things, pugs. Ugh. The first time we get to see it is as it emerges from the water, bringing up Cavil, whom is holding onto one of the limbs, from front to back, the second on the right side, which promptly gets cut off, and we can see that one of its other 7, possibly also the second but on the left side, is already missing. As the action continues, it becomes increasingly more difficult to keep track of what the limbs are doing, and subsequently what this creature is capable of doing. In part because whenever the camera cuts, the monster is in a different position than it was in prior to the cut. And no, this is not the typical thing for cinema, where when they cut to a different angle, you don't see a direct continuation of the motion, but rather a very short repeat before resuming to the point where the angle changed, for the purpose of making sure the viewer doesn't get disoriented and is still aware of what is happening as the camera angle change occurs. The beast both thrusts with the cut off limbs and uses them for support throughout the engagement, as in it uses them to keep itself standing. Imagine having one foot cut off above your ankle and using the freshly acquired stub to stand up, applying all that pressure directly onto the wound and leaning into it for additional pressure as you lunge forward. Perhaps it's not as painful as I imagine. I still have all of my limbs. I might have to chop one off just to test it out. Now, from the moment when the monster grabs onto Cavil and pushes him underwater and up until the end of the scene, as the camera cuts back and forth between above and under, there are a number of instances where the continuity gets completely left by the wayside. I could go into a detailed recanting of the scene moment by moment, but suffice it to say you can observe this for yourselves if you are so interested, simply by going back to the scene, slowing it down, and just trying to keep a record of what is happening. Now, I can fully understand that this may all sound a bit confusing, and I can hear you all saying, who cares, and why is this as important as I may have made it appear to be? Well, in the grand scheme of things, this particular scene would not be all that significant if we ignore the part where our protagonist's life is at stake, and that at least a couple of times he survives through editing trickery, or his opponent starts doing one thing but ends up doing something else. But when it comes to the storytelling and presentation part of the discussion, this is the scene that you open your show on. In this context, I expect that the scene should be impactful. I would expect for it to convey as much relevant and necessary information to the audience as possible, and to have it just be a good representation of what is to come, of what people should be expecting from the rest of the show. And unfortunately, in that respect, it's quite the mixed bag, because in a strange kind of way it succeeds at doing that, just not quite in the way that the showrunners would have hoped for it to do, I believe. This scene represents the show on a meta level almost perfectly, although this particular point may change as we end up going through the rest of the season. This is a work in progress after all. The story beats are all fairly solid, and the visuals used to represent those story beats are quite well done, for the most part. But when you look behind the outer shell, at the inner mechanisms, you see that it isn't quite as well put together as it may have initially appeared, as a result of certain continuity errors or unexplained happenings, contrivances, although these may in fairness be contextualized and justified given the primary theme that is meant to pervade the story throughout, as will become somewhat evident later on, or questionable character motivations and decisions. Getting back to the episode, we have Cavill making his way to a village, which we learn is called Blaviken, and visits a tavern in order to ask for directions. As he enters said tavern, all of the chatter quiets down to merely hushed whispers, and upon addressing the barkeep, he immediately receives resistance, both from the barkeep himself as well as a group of patrons. He gets antagonized, and just before any actual violence would kick off between Cavill and these guys, a young woman from behind calls out for them to cut the crap. Now, it is at this point that I must mention that this dude with the approachable attitude, the apparent head of the aforementioned antagonizing group of patrons, is a full head shorter than our main man and nowhere near as built, so I'm a bit confused as to what he expects he's going to be able to do in support of his bravado.
What the hell are we supposed to use, man? Harsh language?
Because pure muscle is not going to cut it. Perhaps they're going with the whole strength through numbers approach, though given the reputation of Witchers in the society, you still have to question their boldness here. Anyway, it turns out that the Goon Squad is with this woman. We find out her name, Renfrey, after which she and Cavill engage in some beer drinking and small talk. A very short while later, they get interrupted by a girl.
How much coin for your Kiki more then?
And Cavill leaves the tavern with said girl. All in all, this scene is quite a decent way of giving us more information about the world. Cavill's character is not ordinary, being referred to as a mutant. The common folk are at the very least apprehensive about him, as indicated by the chatter dying down the moment he shows up. People can be quite confrontational towards him, see the barkeep and Goon Squad, and we get an idea of what it is that he does. He deals with monsters. The dialogue flows fairly naturally and character interactions are believable, which makes this method of world building and characterization quite well done so far. We cut outside the tavern, and it turns out Cavill killed the wrong monster. All is not lost, however, for he can still get some coin for his kill from the village's wizard. He asks the girl to take him to said wizard, and as Cavill starts leading the horse, he refers to him or her as Roach. Fans already know that his horse's name is Roach, but for the show, it would be more of an indication that he is not a heartless creature, and that he has an affection towards animals in the same way anyone else does, making Witchers, or at least him in particular, not as different from other people as those others may choose to believe. Along the way, we get a bit more world building. We're finally given our protagonist's name, Geralt from Rivia, as well as some more perceptions regarding the Witchers as seen by the common folk. Basically hellspawn freaks. They reach a tower, Geralt passes through a magical gate and is met with the sight of a very bright display of fruit trees, sunlight, completely unlike the actual heavily overcast sky that we saw just now. What seems to be a large floating tree in the center. Oh, and copious amounts of nudity. Yeah, there's plenty of that. A man with a beard and the staff greets him and introduces himself as Master Stregobor. Geralt cuts through the wizard speak and calls him out for being in hiding since among the villagers he went by a different name. We find out that the Witchers are now much fewer in number than they once were, and the wizard makes a remark about how Witchers don't feel anything, which is a statement that already contrasts with that little bit from earlier with Roach. Geralt tells us that he is not much of a believer in destiny, and it turns out that the wizard is looking to have a certain human dealt with, a certain individual called Renfrey. Yeah, that one. We now cut to a completely different location, Walden City, to the market square, where we have a group of children playing. We get a glimpse at what appears to be nothing whatsoever, and after a group of knights come along, they request that the girl who stayed behind as the rest of the children fled needs to go with them. Wouldn't you know it? It turns out the girl is royalty, as we immediately cut to her all pampered up, present at a knighting ceremony, where we find out that this is the kingdom of Sintra. We have the queen doing the actual knighting, while the girl, along with an older man, the king, and her grandfather as we're told, are standing just behind the queen and are going for a bit of banter, which prompts the queen to hush them. The man in particular. This of course doesn't stop him from trolling the queen for a little bit longer.
Grant me leave, my queen. I'm worn from my trip to the Isles, and my bad chamber duties before that.
We get a close-up shot of the girl's face, and before we cut away, we hear Stregobor saying,
"Destiny has many faces."
which immediately establishes a connection between this girl and Geralt. so far so obvious. We are now presented with the recanting of what is referred to as the Curse of the Black Sun. Doomsday prophecy, end of days heralded by 60 crowned women, river valleys full of blood, yada yada. We've heard this before a million times already. Bottom line, he either knows or merely believes that Renfri is one of those 60 and wants to take her out of the picture before she has the opportunity to play her role in said Doomsday prophecy. The wizard had studied some of the women whom presented internal mutations and whom all died. This prompts Geralt to call him out for killing innocent women, only to have Gandalf here framing it as the lesser evil when compared to what would have happened without his intervention. And it quickly comes out that his reason for being in hiding is because, guess what? On this occasion, Renfri is actually aware of his intentions and is attempting to kill him instead. Turns out Renfri is in fact a princess, and that even as a child she was doing the whole killing of pet birds and puppies, gouging of the maid's eyes and such. The old man had already sent someone after her, and they were apparently unsuccessful. He had lost track of her for 2 years, only to find her again engaged in more personable activities, involving the gutting and impaling of innocent merchants. We're told that mutants in this world are immune to magic, which doesn't make a whole deal of sense to me. I mean, if you were to lob a fireball at a mutant, would they not still burn? Or perhaps it is only a certain type of magic that they're immune to. So far in the show, we're not given much insight into the nature of the magic of this universe, so perhaps the more offensive type of magic is just not a thing. We'll have to see about that as the season carries on. We get Destiny being brought up yet again, as a framing of the overlapping events of Geralt showing up at the same time as the wizard only just managing to find Renfri again, and the magic man straight up asks Geralt to kill her. What follows is a series of exchanges, the purpose of which is to give us insight into the mindset of Geralt, which is ultimately summed up with evil is evil, and that if he should ever be in the position to choose between them, that he would rather not choose at all. Now, whether we ourselves agree with his point of view or not, this is how his character is established, and it will be worth keeping this in mind for the events coming up in the future, whether he holds to this belief, and if not, then why not? There is of course an entire conversation that can be held about this statement alone and its philosophical implications, but that is a bit beyond the scope of this video unless it becomes relevant later in the season. We cut back to a feast in Sintra with everyone we've already seen in attendance. We get a bit more banter between the three, and a fourth, whom is implied to be a wizard. The king, iced as we come to learn, had seen an omen of war earlier in the day. The queen scoffs at this, and we're told that there is conflict in the north, instigated by Nilfgaard, another kingdom we can safely assume, and that if anything, this conflict is an indication that something called the Wild Hunt is running late. There's no elaboration on what this means as of yet, perhaps later. She goes on by saying that even if any conflict should make its way to them, they would be prepared, and would even have reinforcements on the way from Skellige. It is implied that this is where the king is from, and that their marriage was most likely for political reasons. The girl calls out the dismissive attitude for being a mask hiding actual concern. The queen, despite wanting to protect the princess from the harsher realities of rulership while still a child, had been herself exposed to them and came out triumphant at a similar age. She now attempts to teach the girl a quick lesson by telling her that in reality it is impossible to be fully prepared for war, and that one should keep their sword close and to keep moving. This is perhaps something about always being aware of your surroundings, not growing complacent or overly confident to the point of being blind to your own shortcomings. I guess we'll find out if it comes up again later. We are shown that the girl is not interested in the courtly aspects of her life, but acquiesces to them nevertheless. The betrothal feast of the queen's daughter is brought up briefly, which she says was necessary for the good of her kingdom, and before any banter is to start up again, the one black man in the entirety of this kingdom, yeah, I'm as confused as you are, comes up to the queen with news. Turns out the bad guys are headed their way after all. Now, who could have possibly foreseen this development? We cut to Geralt and Roach in the forest, with Renfri coming up to confront him about his meeting with Stregobor, and she drops the A-bomb of
Stregobor's man raped me.
Revenge is apparently her objective, and after a bit more exchanging of information that we already know, this is where the show does the first instance of something that has given so many people a headache when going through it. She says that Queen Calanthe of Sintra, presumably Queen Vance, had just won her first battle at Hoshbuz, presumably in an attempt to win Geralt's favor and to turn him against Stregobor, though I failed to see how that particular statement is supposed to accomplish this. Perhaps she believes him to be the type of person who would place value on such feats? Who knows. And yes, this is the battle that was brought up earlier as having taken place when the queen was the same age as the princess. This means that what we are experiencing here is non-sequential storytelling. So this is where we are going to have to talk about something. The way in which this show tells its story is, in principle, perfectly fine. There is nothing inherently wrong with presenting your story in a disjointed manner such as this, as long as you put in all of the necessary groundwork to allow your viewer or reader or listener or what have you to be able to still follow along and to either be aware of the fact that this is what they're engaging with, or that if they're intended to piece this together later through a reveal, or even after the story had concluded, that the events they are seeing don't intersect in ways that would confuse them. For instance, here, the event which is being referenced as a means through which we are to learn of this aspect of the show's storytelling is being brought up in the scene directly following another scene in which we've initially learned of it for the first time. The problem is that the event in question, the battle, was only brought up once, in passing, and was not given much time to settle in our minds, such that it would be more difficult to miss or to forget. Notice how I didn't actually mention this battle on its initial introduction. This is because the significance of its first mention isn't about the battle, but about the characters who were interacting. In my case, going through the episode for the first time, I had missed this element entirely, because there were so many new and unfamiliar names of characters and places, as well as events past and current, thrown at me in quick succession, that I simply failed to remember the name of the battle, or to give this particular line from Renfri too much consideration, because it didn't seem relevant to the immediate, more pressing matter, which is her attempting to convince Geralt to aid her in her quest for revenge. The significance of this second mention is only marginally more relevant to the exchange we are witnessing than the first time, merely by virtue of its repetition. The fact that this line from Renfri is the first mention of the Queen of Sintra's actual name is only working further towards making it more difficult to connect the two scenes, since had we known the Queen's name beforehand, a name which would be harder to overlook or to forget given her character's significance in the universe, instead of the name of some battle that happened at some point in the past, which again wasn't even the focus of the conversation where it was originally brought up, but merely a point with which to illustrate the similarity between the two characters on screen. Then this particular mention of the Queen's name would have given more significance to the mention of the battle in the scene prior as well, by extension. This may all come across as a lot of nonsense on my part, but the point I'm trying to make here is that this line from Renfri, on a meta level, is meant to be our clue towards understanding the nature of the show's non-sequential storytelling, but it does it poorly. What happens here is that the thing that we're supposed to take note of is the fact that a certain event that was mentioned before as having taken place long in the past is mentioned again now as having just taken place recently. The problem with this is that it is very easy to miss because of the simple fact that 25 minutes into the first episode of a fantasy show, viewers may not have yet gotten to remember all the names that they were given up to this point in the episode, and that we still have close to no understanding of the actual locations in this world. The difficulty in establishing the connection is further exacerbated by the fact that the only connecting tissue here is purely the name of the battle and nothing else. The name of the Queen is supposed to be another piece of connecting tissue, but unfortunately this is the first time we've ever heard it, making this second connection not actually take place as was most likely intended. The most frustrating aspect of this is that it could have been so easy to add in a line or two in the preceding scene to have us learn her name. Quick example would be when the one guy came in with the report, he could have said something like, "Queen Calanthe, I bring news from the north." It would be perfectly fitting for someone like that to refer to her in that manner, and it would help us greatly here as well. Bear in mind, this is one possible solution that took me less than 5 seconds to come up with. An entire cast of paid writers can surely do better. They clearly wanted the clue to be subtle and to be something that comes up naturally in conversation, but not only was it subtle in the fact that we had very little to work with, but also failed to have it be relevant to the situation in which it was brought up, since, again, this event is irrelevant to what Renfri and Geralt are actually discussing. Moving on, to finish off this scene, we have Renfri attempting to draw parallels between the two of them, and after refuting this, Geralt presents her with the choice of either staying on her path of revenge and becoming a monster, or leaving Blaviken and living the rest of her life as a human. We now cut to an empty field, with Calanthe and Iced on horseback and with troops in tow as they watch the invading Nilfgaardian army headed their way. A battle begins, with the two being not only on the front line but also the first to make contact with the enemy forces, whom, by the way, outnumbered them to a hilarious degree. I'm going to just say that this is a dumb trope and that it needs to stop. Fantasy or not, the king and or queen should not be on the front lines of a military engagement against overwhelming opposing forces. They should be giving orders, not jumping into the meat grinder in the first 5 minutes of the engagement. Cutting back to Sintra, we have the princess lamenting being kept in the keep and the wizard telling her that this is what they must do. He brings up a story of cursed princesses whom were locked in towers and then later killed. A lesson on disobedience perhaps, though that isn't very clear. I mean, is the moral here don't be disobedient or else you'll get locked up and killed? Beats me. She asks if her grandmother will be alright. Wiz tells her that she will be alright since she is her blood, and that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Way to dodge the question, buddy. Back at the battle, we get to see some decent attempts at making armor in cinema actually be somewhat useful, by having people get stabbed through gaps. Only to then immediately throw all of that away by having people slicing right through breastplates as though they weren't even there. That didn't last long now, did it? Anyway, the good guys are getting their asses handed to them. You went in against overwhelming odds, what exactly did you expect, you numpties? Iced yells exactly that. And Calanthe mispronounces Gallagher. Iced takes an arrow to the eye. Surely you could have had a couple more tries without the dirt making him once, guys, come on. It turns out the arrow came from a singular dude on horseback whom looked like he only loosed the one arrow to no-scope headshot the king and then sheathed the bow only to chill for the rest of the engagement. Gee, I wonder if this guy is relevant in any way. Somehow, in this bloody slaughter, where they're losing hard, the queen manages to have enough time with people fighting around her to fall to her knees and mourn over the body of her spouse. Agent 47 is still on his horse, just chilling, looking like he can't wait for this thing to be over so he can catch the big game. And the queen yells some more, makes her way past the two dudes who are presumably protecting her? Them? With their shields? I don't even. She charges his way, and cut. We can now safely assume that everyone is dead. It goes without saying that the execution of this entire battle is not very good. Back in Sintra, the princess is walking through the keep. She overhears a woman praying through an open door, gets noticed by said woman as she turns around. The woman bows to her, and we finally learn what her name is. Princess Cirilla. Interesting how we could have a simple short line like this to tell us the name of a character, but we couldn't have that for the frickin' queen. After walking on a bit longer, we see more of the guests, and as we hear a commotion back the way she came, she turns around and rushes over. Turns out the queen isn't dead. How she made it back here is completely beyond me, but whatever. She did. The queen made it back, but she is seriously wounded. Things get somber, things get sad, and she sends the one black man, yes, still the only one, still as out of place as before, to check if they have enough supplies in the keep. Mousesack, I don't even know what to say about this name. The wizard sets up a magical barrier around the keep entrance as we see the rest of the city being invaded, and thus we have a temporary reprieve for a handful of characters. We cut to Geralt in the forest as he's setting up camp and talking to Roach about what witchers should stick to and what not to get involved in, about how he killed his first monster. And we see Renfri coming up. He finishes talking, and after Renfri grills him for talking to his horse, she says that she made her choice, that she's going to leave tomorrow. She comes on to Geralt, they start smooching, and we cut away. Are you sure this is a good idea there, buddy? I mean, I'm just saying, gouging maids' eyes out, impaling merchants, and killing pets is a bit of a red flag if you ask me. Back in Sintra, it's nighttime, and as the keep is still being assaulted, the barrier finally drops. The invaders get happy and they charge in. Up top, as things seem dire, Calanthe whispers to Mousesack that he is in the gatekeep. He? Who's he? He replies with a comment about destiny. I don't quite know how many times it is now that this word came up in this episode, but you can be sure that it will come up so many more times by the end of the season. The queen sends everyone off, and she tells Ciri to know when to stop moving, continuing the first lesson from back at the feast. Although if I understood the first part right, then I'm not sure how this second part fits in. Oh well. She says that the baddies don't take prisoners, we cut to the most awkward throat slitting I've ever seen, and that they're sadistic bastards. So far so cliche. Mousesack returns and informs her that he is gone. Queenie imparts onto her granddaughter some words about leadership and how the world depends on her. A bit of an exaggeration perhaps, or maybe not. As she is to leave, in the commotion she screams, which causes everything to shake strongly, which does not go unnoticed. Ciri is told to find Geralt of Rivia, whom she is told is her destiny, and they head off. Apparently, whatever happened when the girl screamed is the reason Nilfgaard invaded. Something we'll have to take their word for, because for the moment this doesn't make a whole lot of sense due to a lack of information regarding what it is that we just witnessed. Queenie musters her last strength to go to the window for reasons, and as the rest of them make their way out of the keep, Mousesack needs to stay behind in order to allow Ciri to escape. We now get to see Agent 47 up close, who gives chase after Ciri and the knight accompanying her, whom he no-scopes as well, which causes both of them to fall off the horse. We cut to Geralt lying on the ground, asleep. We get confirmation, or maybe not, that they boned through flashes of said boning, and he seems to be having a vision, or hearing Renfri speak to him while half out of it. It's unclear which. Either way, it's something about him covered in blood in a market square and being unsure of himself with a stoning for a reward. She says that he will try to outrun the girl in the woods, but that he cannot. Apparently this can be misinterpreted. I don't get how. It's pretty obvious what this is supposed to mean for us, but whatever. After which he wakes up suddenly and mentions the market. At the market square in Blaviken, Geralt walks broodingly, holding a sword in a peculiar fashion and without his normal out-and-about gear. He runs into the goon squad from earlier in the episode, who tell him that they were expecting him. He asks where Renfri is and is told that she's at the tower. More nonsense about the lesser evil as the goon squad get ready to get dirty. Geralt lets out a low but firm "fuck," and the fight begins with a crossbow bolt knocked aside mid-flight with his sword. We're in for gold, folks. I won't get into too much detail since there are enough folks out there who have and are much more adequate at illustrating what's done well and what isn't. Martial arts are not an area that I am too familiar with, but there's plenty that is clearly nonsensical in this fight regardless. Long story short, he makes fairly quick work of the lot of them, whom very characteristically decide to come at him in a conga line. And he shows an ability to use some magic as well in the form of a wave of energy of some kind. Those familiar with the universe already know perfectly well what it is, though it seems to be very ineffective in this particular instance, thereby serving as little more than a visual, "Hey guys, look, it's that thing you recognize." Don't get me wrong, there have been quite a few similar winks towards those already versed in the universe by this point in the episode, but they were minor and were fairly well justified within the dialogue to where it wasn't worth drawing attention to them at the time. The fight ends with Renfri showing up with a sword at the neck of the girl who led Geralt, and her supposedly at this point, to Stregobor's tower. She says that he chose. No clue what she means by this. Between lesser evils, maybe? How would she know about that? He didn't say it to her. That whole thing was between Geralt and the wizard. Anyway, Geralt asks her to let the girl free, and she makes it clear that she wasn't successful in her plan by threatening to kill everyone if Voldemort doesn't leave the tower. He attempts to make her leave with some other magic. Yes, that. And she says that magic doesn't work on her, but that silver does. In this universe, silver being a bit of a kryptonite material to all things monster. Also, if there was any uncertainty about whether or not the wizard was wrong about her, it should be confirmed at this point, at the very least, that she is a mutant. She releases the girl and another fight starts. Again, there are acceptable parts in the choreography, there are cringy ones, blah blah. Obviously he wins, and as she's dying, she tells him that the girl in the woods, who does she mean, will always be with him, that she is his destiny. Now, I have to mention here that I do not understand what her plan was. So, she clearly lied to Geralt earlier when she told him that she was going to leave Blaviken. She then tried to get to the wizard and failed, but left her goons behind to wait for Geralt at the market square? Did she know that he would go to the square to look for her? Was she only hoping for that to happen? When Geralt went to the market square, did he expect to have to fight Renfri? Her goons? The wizard? Once Renfri's plan didn't get her anywhere since she couldn't enter the tower, what exactly did she expect was going to happen? She knew that the wizard wanted her dead, she knew that the wizard tried to hire Geralt to do so, and when presented with the option to just move on, she essentially chose death instead because she just couldn't give up her desire for revenge? She couldn't possibly have expected to actually beat Geralt in a fight, did she? At this point, it's no guessing matter that she had some ability to see into the future, whether as a result of her mutation or not, whether a vision or something else, and the fact that we don't understand what the scope of this ability is just kind of leaves her entire decision making in question. We cut back to Sintra, where Agent 47 is taking Ciri away from the burning city. She super screams, freaking out Sniper Man and his horse, causing the latter to stumble and the both of them to fall off, and as he tries to grab onto her, she screams a few more times, which ends up being strong enough to cause a stone crystal pillar thing to crack and fall in between her and the dude, which then collapses the ground beneath and forms a chasm between the two of them. That fucking thing just keeps expanding like a sinkhole, oh my god, which allows her to escape. I can't even begin to explain this. We cut back to Blaviken Market, where the wizard makes his way to see the aftermath, and as he attempts to retrieve Renfri's body, Geralt threatens to kill him if he does so. The old man says that her mutation influences people, and that it got to Geralt as well. I guess he's just wrong here, since this isn't what we were led to believe that she can do. Unless he is correct and the fortune telling is entirely unrelated. He makes a scene of what happened here to turn the people around him against the Witcher and tells him that he made a choice and that he won't know if it was the right one. People start throwing rocks at Geralt and he leaves. Again, bringing up this choice thing. What choice did he make between lesser evils? Because he didn't make the choice. Renfri made the choice to get herself killed. The choice to come to the square? I don't know. Did he come since he felt compelled to because that's what he saw in his vision? If it wasn't a vision though, but instead Renfri talking to him while he's half unconscious, then he was basically led there by Renfri. So then if he went there because he saw a vision, but Renfri was also aware of this vision, then what, did she give him the vision? Is that what the old man here meant when he mentioned that her mutation influences people? Did she have the vision and compelled Geralt to come to the square? Even if that's the case, how is this his choice? In case anybody was still unsure about the girl in the woods, we hear Renfri's words again and we're shown Ciri running through the woods. The end. So with all of that out of the way, let's end with a bit about the episode overall. The set design so far is fantastic, the music is very fitting, the acting was surprisingly good in many places, a bit off in others, and despite my initial reservations when it came to Henry Cavill playing the role of Geralt in live action, it turns out he was pretty much perfect for the part, totally believable as Geralt. The makeup department did a great job with making him look like the character, and his outfit was also quite clearly recognizable for anyone who is already familiar with the franchise, and the costume design in general is more of a hit than a miss. But when it misses, boy does it miss hard. As I brought up at the beginning, I believe that they employ the usage of color filters a bit too heavily at times, but there is obvious competence on a technical level being displayed here despite this, if we actually look at the rest of the cinematography throughout. There are also plenty of elements that are less than stellar, most of which are in the editing and writing department. There are more superficial things like the armor of the Nilfgaard forces. I've heard possible reasons why they look the way they do, and to be honest, I don't know what would be worse. If they made them intentionally look like this because they were supposed to look like walking genitalia, or if they simply didn't have any idea what to do for the armor of the bad guys and just said fuck it. Whatever the case, I think it is inexcusable to have any army be decked out in armor that looks like a frickin' black trash bag. Then there is of course the choreography for all of the fight scenes. The opening scene with the monster that swaps limbs in between shots when it had no business doing so. The fact that the scene opens up on perfectly still water, out of which Geralt and the monster emerge, only for us to see that there was no place for them to have possibly been for that to be the case. When the camera goes underwater, we see a completely flat lake bed all across. Or the fact that they would have to have been there for quite some time for the water to go fully still. What would they have been doing anyway? Cuddling gently? Not to mention that between close-up shots and distance shots, the water that they're in is also of inconsistent depth. Look for this yourselves. When the camera is far away, the water is barely ankle high. In close shots, it's roughly thigh-high. The battle between the Cintran and Nilfgaardian forces was a joke, and then the two fights in the market square were a mixed bag. Now, when it comes to the writing for the episode, there are plenty of things that are done well, or at the very least an indicator of a good angle for them to approach the writing from, such as giving us information about the world and the characters through naturally flowing dialogue, though not 100% successful here, as well as through non-verbal character interactions. The decision to have non-sequential storytelling is potentially interesting if they manage to pull it off well. So far we're merely at the start, so there hasn't been much to mess anything up just yet, aside from what I've brought up earlier as being somewhat mishandled. It remains to be seen if they'll manage to make it work by the end of the season. And then there are the obvious things that are just question marks all across. The motivation behind Renfri's actions, Geralt right at the end here, and so on. All in all, at this point in the show we have only just seen the beginning of the story, so there isn't all that much to discuss regarding the story itself. It's been mostly world building, establishing characters, and kicking off the plot. Hopefully the rest of the season will manage to deliver us an interesting and well executed story with as few hiccups along the way as possible, though that remains to be seen. Moving into the rest of the season, we basically come out of this episode with a number of questions, mostly pertaining to the scope of magic in this universe, what exactly the Witchers are and what they're capable of, what was the initial ghoulish appearance for Geralt all about, what is the deal with Ciri's power, and how was that supposed to be the reason for an invasion, well beyond just Sintra, and how is this whole Destiny thing meant to come in and ultimately tie everything together? These are my thoughts on episode 1 of The Witcher on Netflix, folks. This whole thing here is pretty new for me, and I'm sure that there was a lot that I could have done a better job with, and I welcome any feedback on how to improve. I will be taking it all into consideration and look into how I can implement it moving forward. With that said, see you for episode 2.